Martin Scorsese's 1993 romantic period piece, The Age of Innocence, starring Daniel Day-Lewis, Michelle Pfeiffer, and Winona Ryder, in a love triangle set in a time of respectability and sophistication.
Foremost authority on form.
The Age of Innocence depicts the aristocratic class of ladies and gentlemen in New York
Most interests me about New York.
during the Gilded Age of the 1870s.
Her dress wasn't smart enough.
Welcome to Romance Wednesdays, the sexiest joint in town on this Valentine's Day special.
Are you very much in love with her?
How will Daniel Day-Lewis navigate between his young untainted fiancée and the more worldly countess? And does Scorsese's partly forgotten romantic masterpiece hold up all these years later? Feel free to like and subscribe, and let's find out. Based on the 1920 novel by Edith Wharton, The Age of Innocence tells the story of upper-class lawyer Newland Archer, engaged to marry the young May Wayland until he meets May's cousin, American heiress Countess Ellen Olenska, fresh from a divorce to a Polish count. So personally for me, the most interesting thing about The Age of Innocence is it's Martin Scorsese, known for a lot of his Italian-American depictions.
I'm a Stones. Don't ever me again! Don't!
Amongst many other things I might add. Doing 19th century WASP New York, doing 1870s aristocrats.
May I tell you what most interests me about New York?
The interesting thing is he made this movie a decade before he made Gangs of New York, the other 19th century New York film that he made.
I'm New York.
This is a modern movie set in New York a good decade or so before we started to see the influx of the Jewish and the Italians and all the other immigrants. And still, the upper class of Manhattan at that time is what Scorsese refers to as the Sons of England.
They aren't speaking with a British accent,
Where is that country? Have you ever been there?
but they're the children of England.
Countess is here, after all.
It's Scorsese getting a chance before he done Gangs
Is your mouth all glued up with connie juice? I asked you a question.
to do upmarket Manhattan.
I didn't know when you were leaving again.
He just uses his film techniques to lure you into this particular romance story.
I feel so safe here. I wish that you were with us.
This movie, adapted from the book, is peppered with nostalgia
And requesting reply by messenger.
in a sense that Edith Wharton was born in 1862. So when she would be looking back at the 1870s, that's really the decade she came of age. That alone enticed me into the story even more, into this 19th century portrayal of America where usually it's westerns as opposed to anything else. I love the casting as well as the cinematography in terms of the basic setup of this picture.
A member of a well-known family is backed by that family.
They're the children of England.
Cast-wise, again, I've only seen this movie recently, but having a prime Day-Lewis
I'll see you very soon in Paris.
around the time he done Last of the Mohicans,
I will find you!
a few years before he done The Crucible, it's again him being in a bunch of pre-20th century American movies that aren't westerns.
Then explain to me why you will not...
Because it is my name!
Oh, you got a murderous rage in you, and I like it.
I feel so terribly tired.
Years later, seeing The Age of Innocence with Day-Lewis as this Anglo-American, I'm like, you can put him at the front of that catalogue of Anglo-Americans in the pre-20th century in terms of his portrayal, his reserved, passive acting and performance in The Age of Innocence.
It's so difficult to find the right words.
It's just as palpable as a good performance as he is as Bill the Butcher in The Gangs of New York.
The Butcher's original apprentice!
Goodbye.
In terms of Michelle Pfeiffer, well, she was at her absolute apex in The Age of Innocence in terms of being this attractive Hollywood, to an extent, sex symbol, but she was like the actor's sex symbol.
Why are you dressed up like Batman?
Because he is Batman, you moron.
Shall I come to you once and then go home?
She was pretty, but she could definitely act. I mean, for me, in Scarface, she's too young, right? She's still up and coming at that point.
Where's you from?
Baltimore.
Baltimore?
Dangerous Minds like the tail end of her prime.
There are no victims in this classroom.
The juxtaposition with Pfeiffer, you got the ultra sexiness of Catwoman in Batman Returns, and then you had her as this graceful, elegant countess.
Yes, I know.
Perfect casting. She's got the right actor's acumen for this role. You needed an actress that was going to be believable as this kind of 19th century worldly woman that's going to lure a 19th century gentleman away from his younger fiancée.
Seems that you intended to go
Never
for
mind, it sounds too complicated.
In terms of Winona Ryder now, well, again, this is like Ryder at the tail end of her young prime.
Is your life perfect?
Oh yeah, I'm on my way to a party at Remington University.
Sounds too complicated.
You got to remember, she came out of nowhere with Heathers, and she was like 17 at the time.
Lick it up, baby. Lick it up.
By the time she's doing this movie, it's like 5 years later. She's, what, 21, 22? So she's still essentially a kid.
Sounds too complicated.
Playing the younger role, but she's been in the game of acting for years now. She's been a big star. She's done Edward Scissorhands. She's done a bunch of stuff by the time she's doing this role. So in terms of that love triangle, I can't think of a better cast in 1993 than the cast that they casted. The fact Ryder won a Golden Globe speaks for itself. She's playing this kind of, on the surface, innocent and simple, behind the scenes, manipulative but boring, incurious girl who just, you know, way more malignant behind the scenes than you'd give her credit for on the surface. Only Ryder could do this role. In terms of Scorsese taking on the romance genre, there's a quote at the time he said, "Oh, this is my most violent role."
Scorsese himself called it the most violent film in his repertoire.
Obviously, don't take that literally. Of course, he was being hyperbolic at the time. But there is something to be said for the frustrated undertones and the frustrated, you know, potential anger of being entangled in unconsummated love.
I've never made love to you, but you are the woman I would have married if it had been possible for either of us.
You can say that when you're the one who's made it impossible.
I've made it!
It's a classic tale of forbidden love, matters of the heart, etc. Scorsese typically would do a more gritty take on, let's say, romantic relationships, as opposed to this kind of Disney-esque fairy tale take. But then you got to remember it like, this is only kind of Disney-esque in terms of the setting. Other than that, there is that murky, tragic undertone of the forbidden love dynamic where these two people are idealizing each other, but they can never be.
You wouldn't be happy if it meant being cruel.
But other than that, I don't think it's so out of Scorsese's catalogue doing the romance thing. For me, it's like, just watch Color of Money.
Show me what you got here.
Vincent.
The dynamic between Tom Cruise as the young hotshot kid and Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio as the chick, the seasoned chick who's been around the block a little bit more.
Just to know where you went, you know, I was looking for you.
I'm gonna sit down now, is that okay?
Look, I've been in worse places. I've dated worse guys.
Come on.
Okay.
So my point about that reference is Scorsese's always got an interesting take on some of these love dynamics and romance dynamics. Age of Innocence, you got to remember, came out during a time of abundant sexy movies, i.e. of course Basic Instinct, right?
I think she's the fuck of the century.
This film, which is romance, comes out a year after Basic Instinct, and I'm like, it was so refreshing that Scorsese does a story of sexually and romantically repressed aristocrats struggling to come to terms with the fact there's a bunch of social norms preventing them to come together. These are two standoffish, passive characters, as opposed to Michael Douglas and Sharon Stone in Basic Instinct, who are two lustful, horny bastards.
It was the fuck of the century.
We have these standoffish aristocrats.
Might at least consider it.
Again, in terms of the timing, he's not just going for the erotic thriller commercial stuff.
Basic Instinct, rated R. Starts Friday, March 20th at a theater near you.
He's doing this kind of unique period piece.
Look at her blushing.
Again, speaks to Scorsese's cinematic brilliance and his filmic acumen. There's a certain sensuality to a love affair that doesn't necessarily have 100% consummation. Outside of that, again, not just Color of Money, Scorsese, of course, done Taxi Driver, where we have the kind of self-sabotaging infatuation of De Niro in the Travis Bickle role.
When you least talking, I didn't know you.
Again, a great depiction of frustrated undertones from the lower class.
I sent some flowers.
And of course, Taxi Driver had a homage to previous cinema, just as Age of Innocence pays homage to previous cinema.
And they went to the National Gallery.
The way Taxi Driver takes from the Roaring Twenties movie with Humphrey Bogart and James Cagney.
But I'm not gonna let that stand between you and me. Not the way I feel about you.
Eddie, it's me, Jean.
Mm-hmm. How are you?
You are the most beautiful woman I've ever seen.
He's moved on and he's just resigned to his fate. He's moved on from the infatuation and his idealized romantic viewpoint of the female character. That scene there immortalizes Taxi Driver as this kind of lonely man masterpiece. Taxi Driver took that from the Roaring Twenties, and I'm not saying he plagiarized, but it influenced it.
How have you been getting along?
Hi.
Now bringing that to the Age of Innocence, the scenes where Daniel Day-Lewis and Winona Ryder go for their European honeymoon.
In Paris, she ordered her clothes.
Using the paintings and the montage scene, whether it be down to budget or whatever, that obviously borrows from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I'm like, there's that great parallel reverence in the Age of Innocence. Putting the paintings in 19th century Europe just adds to the mysticism of traveling in a pre-aviation era. Europe is another world from the East Coast. In Butch Cassidy, the East Coast may as well be Europe compared to the Wild West.
You're from the East? I didn't know that.
They're very good.
Great parallels there. But also, in terms of Scorsese taking on the romance genre, the fact it's not a movie about a couple that are free to just hook up and be together and this and that, for me, speaks to the all-time greats vis-a-vis Casablanca.
Of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she walks into mine.
Where Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, they might have been together in the flashback scenes, but throughout the movie, they never actually get to reconcile. That's the tragedy and the great suspense of the masterpiece that is Casablanca. If Scorsese's going to do romance, of course he's going to do something different with a tragic undertone to it. Spoilers here for a movie that is, over 30 years old, right? Having Winona Ryder's character manipulate Lewis into being with her and not pursuing being with Ryder's older cousin, Michelle Pfeiffer, that scene where it's confronted at the end, that scene was kind of tainted with the potential of violence in terms of undertones.
I'd like to do some traveling.
I'm afraid you can't, dear. Not unless you take me with you.
And I'm like, oh, this shit is palpable. When I was watching it, I actually believed there was a chance he was going to strike her.
That is if the doctors will let me go. I'm afraid they won't.
But again, he's a 19th century gentleman, not a mob guy, so he doesn't strike her.
2,000 years!
But I'm like, this kind of passive, unspoken rage at being played, that's kind of the core of the movie in terms of passive behavior as opposed to expressive, I don't know, Sicilian behavior like what Scorsese grew up with.
You're gonna ruin everything for me.
The bit years later in the 20th century when he goes to Paris at the behest of his sons who he's had with Ryder after she's passed of pneumonia, that's an ending for the ages in my opinion. He goes to the apartment where Michelle Pfeiffer lives in Paris. He's contemplating going upstairs to see her.
You mean you won't come?
I don't know. Just say I'm old-fashioned.
All these years later in Paris and he walks off. And for me, it's basically a case of he chooses not to go and see her as that's a life that could have happened but didn't happen. He'd rather just keep the fantasy of her, the idealized version of her, rather than face the reality that his wife played him, denied him of his romantic love, but provided him with the love of fatherhood. His life has now shifted from yearning for romantic love to parenthood. It just ends in Paris. He just stays there and then he just walks off gracefully. Like, such a good ending. He just basically prefers to remember the affair as a fantasy, and it's now a fantasy that he's moved on from. Overall, I would say The Age of Innocence is one of Scorsese's most underrated pictures. Not that people put it down, mind you, it's just not remembered and promoted that much all these years later. Just 19th century, from a kind of historical anthropological perspective, depicting these aristocratic, waspy, kind of high-end elite families in Manhattan at that time. It's fantastic. The music is magical in terms of bringing that world to life.
Dear old place is heaven.
I love the fact that Scorsese's my favorite director, and there's still films that I haven't seen in my later years. I watch it and I'm like, why did I never see this film? Because I remember it being marketed back in '93. I remember the posters everywhere.
The Age of Innocence.
a Martin Scorsese picture.
But it was just one of those movies where I was like, nah, it just did not appeal to me at that time. The casting, the direction, the adaptation of a novel. Oh, that's the other thing I want to say. Some of the voiceover narration.
He had never questioned Archer's fidelity.
The fade to red, the parts where Ryder looks at the camera and speaking,
Love you dearly, your grateful cousin.
Really makes this a novel that's been brought to the big screen rather than just a novel being adapted into a movie. Overall, I'm going to give this movie an 8 out of 10. It's not the Middle Ages, it's still at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, so it's historical, but it's not centuries old. This is about classical romance, unconsummated or fully consummated. This is Romance Wednesdays, the sexiest joint in town. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching sexiness being developed on screen. As I always say, feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.